Your soulmate's secret property just became yours. The address will shock you. See the photo. My beloved child. Something connected to your soulmate has quietly shifted into your hands, and the strangest part is not the property itself. It is the address. For a long time, this place was kept out of ordinary conversations, hidden behind paperwork, old memories, and a decision your soulmate was not ready to explain. But now, something has changed. Your name has become connected to a property you may never have known existed. And when you finally understand where it stands, you may realize why its location was kept so carefully guarded. There is also a photograph, one that makes the entire story even harder to dismiss. At first glance, it looks like an ordinary home surrounded by a quiet stretch of land. Look closer, though, and one detail changes everything. Don't skip, because the reason this property became yours begins with something your soulmate did long before you ever knew about it. Your soulmate apparently had a private reason for protecting this place. It was never simply about money, land, or having another address attached to their name. This property represented a future they were afraid to speak about too soon. There were moments when they imagined you standing near that doorway, looking through those windows, and finally understanding what they had been trying to build in silence. Yet they hesitated. Not because they doubted what you meant to them, but because revealing the property would have forced them to reveal something much deeper. Then came an unexpected decision. Instead of keeping complete control over what happened next, they arranged things so the property could eventually become connected to you. And there is one detail in the photograph that hints this was planned more carefully than anyone realized. Near the entrance is something placed there intentionally, something that seems meaningless until you know what your soulmate once said about you. But the address is where this mystery takes a completely different turn. It is not located where you would naturally expect your soulmate to choose. The location carries a connection to your story, possibly a place, memory, or direction that once seemed insignificant but stayed in their mind. That is why seeing the full address may feel strangely familiar. And there is more. Someone else knew about this property before you did. That person had been trusted with a photograph, a few private instructions, and one request. Nothing was supposed to reach you until the timing was right. Now that timing appears to have changed. Something huge is waiting for you, because the photograph contains another clue that explains why your soulmate chose this particular property for you. And once you understand what is hidden just beyond the front entrance, the shocking address may no longer be the biggest secret at all. What waits beyond that entrance is the detail your soulmate never expected you to discover this way. In the photograph, just past the front door, there appears to be a narrow hallway leading toward a bright room at the back of the property. Nothing unusual at first. But your soulmate had apparently chosen that room for a very specific reason. They imagined it becoming the place where the two of you could finally sit without outside voices, expectations, or unfinished conversations following you. And near one of the windows is a small feature that makes the photograph suddenly feel personal. A space deliberately left unfinished. Your soulmate wanted one part of this home to remain untouched until you could decide what belonged there. That means this property was never designed as their private escape. Somewhere along the way, they began thinking of it as yours too. But that still doesn't explain why they chose this address, and that answer is where everything becomes more surprising. The location was not selected because it was impressive or expensive. Your soulmate had another requirement: the property needed to stand somewhere connected to a turning point in their feelings for you. At some moment, they apparently came across this area and felt an immediate connection between the place and the future they had been quietly imagining. They remembered something about you there, perhaps words you once spoke, a dream you mentioned, or a small preference you never expected them to remember. Instead of telling you, they kept searching until they found this particular property. Then they did something even more unexpected. They saved the address separately from the rest of their personal records and gave one trusted person instructions concerning you. Stay till the end, because those instructions explain why everything seems to be unfolding now rather than months ago. Your soulmate had established one condition before you were ever supposed to learn the truth. And that condition had nothing to do with money. They wanted to know whether what existed between you could survive uncertainty without being influenced by possessions, promises, or material security. They never wanted you wondering whether this property was the reason you stayed. So they kept it hidden while watching something far more important: whether the emotional connection remained real when neither of you knew exactly what the future would bring. Then something happened that convinced them the waiting period was over. The trusted person was given permission to bring forward the photograph and the information surrounding the property. But before revealing everything, that person noticed something unusual inside the documents, something even your soulmate may not have realized would become important. Beside the property address was a handwritten note. Only one short sentence was written there, followed by a date. And when you discover what happened on that date, you will understand why your soulmate secretly chose this address with you in mind. That date was not connected to the purchase of the property at all. It pointed back to a moment when your soulmate's feelings for you quietly became serious. Something happened that day, something small enough that you may have forgotten it, yet powerful enough that they remembered every detail. According to the note, that was when they stopped thinking of you as someone who might simply pass through their life. They began imagining permanence. A home. A place where neither of you would have to keep wondering what came next. And the handwritten sentence beside that date made the intention even clearer: this property was supposed to represent a new beginning, not an impressive possession. But there was still one unanswered question. Why this exact address? The answer was buried in another piece of information attached to the photograph, and once it surfaced, even the trusted person handling the documents reportedly understood why your soulmate had remained silent. The street itself carried a strange connection to something you once expressed about the life you wanted. Your soulmate remembered more than you realized. A quiet neighborhood. Privacy. Enough space to breathe. A place that felt removed from pressure but not disconnected from everything important. When this property appeared, several of those details lined up almost perfectly. But then came the coincidence that made your soulmate stop searching. The address contained a number that matched something meaningful from your shared story, a date, an anniversary, or another number attached to a memory they had never forgotten. Suddenly the location felt less like a random listing and more like the place they had been trying to find. Don't skip, because there was another surprise hidden behind the photograph. On the back, written in your soulmate's own handwriting, were several words that revealed exactly who they pictured standing beside them when they first saw the property. Those words were not a declaration about wealth. They were about belonging. Your soulmate had written a private reminder that if the right moment ever arrived, you should be allowed to make this place feel like your own rather than simply stepping into a life someone else had already designed. That explains the unfinished space near the window. It explains why certain rooms in the photograph look almost intentionally empty. Your soulmate wanted you to have choices. But there is something they could not have predicted. When the property information was reviewed again, another photograph appeared among the documents, an older image taken before your soulmate acquired the place. And in the background of that picture was something strangely recognizable. Not a person, but a landmark connected to the surrounding area. The moment its identity became clear, the address stopped feeling merely surprising. Because that landmark may connect this property to a place from your own past. And your soulmate may have known that connection long before you did. The landmark in that older photograph changes the meaning of everything. It stands far beyond the property line, partially hidden behind trees, but its shape is unmistakable once you know where to look. Your soulmate had noticed it during their first visit, and instead of treating it like an ordinary feature of the area, they quietly asked questions about its history. That search led them to a connection they never expected. Years before this property entered their life, the surrounding area had been linked to a memory you once mentioned almost casually. You may not even remember describing it. But your soulmate did. They remembered the emotion in your voice more than the details themselves, and when they realized this home stood near that same place, their entire attitude toward the property changed. Suddenly, the unusual address and that familiar landmark were pointing toward the same question: had your soulmate been searching for a home near something meaningful to you all along? What happened next suggests the answer may be yes. Instead of purchasing immediately, your soulmate reportedly returned to the property more than once. They walked through the empty rooms, stood near that unfinished window, and looked toward the landmark as though trying to picture you recognizing it for yourself. But there was one concern. If they revealed the location too early, you might understand exactly what they were planning. So they kept the address private, even from people who normally knew their important decisions. Only one trusted person received the full details. And that person was told something very specific. If circumstances ever changed unexpectedly, the photograph and property documents were supposed to reach you. Something huge is waiting for you, because those instructions were recently activated. Yet nobody expected to find an additional envelope stored with them, an envelope bearing your name. Inside was not a long letter. Your soulmate had apparently chosen only a few carefully written lines, because they wanted the property itself to explain the rest. They described the home as a place where you would never need permission to belong, where your choices would matter, and where an unfinished room was waiting for your touch. Then came the line that made the trusted person look at the address again. Your soulmate mentioned that once you saw the front of the property in person, you should look across the road before walking inside. Why? The original photograph does not show what stands there clearly enough. But a newer image does. And directly opposite the property is something that connects the address to another chapter of your story, something so specific that coincidence suddenly becomes difficult to accept. Your soulmate knew you would recognize it immediately. But the most important question remains unanswered. How did they know this place meant something to you when you never remember telling them the full story? The answer begins with a conversation you may have considered completely ordinary. Long before the property became part of this story, you apparently shared a memory without realizing how carefully your soulmate was listening. You described a place from your past, not necessarily by its exact address, but through tiny details. The view. The road. The feeling you associated with being there. Most people would have forgotten those details within days. Your soulmate didn't. Later, when they came across this property and looked across the road, those forgotten words suddenly returned to them. That was why they took the second photograph. They needed to compare what they were seeing with what they remembered you describing. And when the pieces matched, they reportedly stood there in silence, realizing they had accidentally found something far more personal than a house. But there was another discovery waiting inside the property's history. Before completing their plans, your soulmate asked to see older records connected to the land. They expected ordinary information: previous ownership, renovations, boundaries, dates. Instead, one detail caught their attention immediately. A previous owner had preserved an old photograph of the property from years earlier, when the surrounding area looked completely different. In that image, the house was smaller, the trees were younger, and the road across from it was barely developed. Yet one feature remained exactly where it stands today. That familiar landmark. Your soulmate suddenly understood that the connection wasn't temporary, it had been part of this place for years. Stay till the end, because this is when their secret plan changed. They stopped thinking about the property as something they would someday show you and began arranging for you to have a genuine claim to it. That decision explains why your name now matters so much in the documents. Your soulmate didn't want to simply hand you a key and call it a surprise. They wanted something stronger, a sign that this place was never meant to depend entirely on their presence or permission. But before everything could be completed, they added one final instruction to the envelope. You were supposed to see a particular photograph before being given the complete address. At first, that instruction seemed strange. Now it makes perfect sense. The photograph was taken from inside the unfinished room, looking outward through the window. On the glass, faintly reflected behind the camera, is something nobody noticed until the image was examined again: a small object your soulmate had already placed inside the room. And attached to that object is a tag bearing 2 words. Those 2 words reveal what your soulmate had secretly planned for this property from the very beginning, and why they were willing to put it into your hands. Those 2 words were simple: for you. Nothing dramatic. Nothing designed for anyone else to see. The tag had been attached to a small wooden box your soulmate placed near the unfinished room before the final photographs were taken. Inside that box was not jewelry or cash, but something far more revealing: a key, an old printed photograph, and a folded piece of paper showing the property's layout. One room had been circled by hand. Beside it, your soulmate had written a question rather than an instruction: what would you make this? That tiny sentence revealed something important. They weren't secretly building a perfect life and expecting you to fit inside it. They were leaving space for your decisions. But the old photograph beneath the key raised another mystery, because it showed the front entrance years earlier, and someone had marked one specific spot beside the doorway. That mark led back to the feature everyone had overlooked. Near the entrance was a small engraved plate, weathered enough to disappear into the background of the newer photograph. Your soulmate discovered it while inspecting the property and became fascinated by the initials carved into its surface. They were not your initials, and they were not theirs. Yet when the property's earlier records were examined, those letters connected to the family that had once cared for the home. That history mattered because the previous owner had refused several offers before accepting your soulmates. Why? According to the documents, they wanted the property to go to someone who would preserve its character instead of tearing everything down. Your soulmate agreed immediately. But then they made an unusual promise. One particular part of the house would remain untouched until another person saw it. That other person was you. And now the reason for that promise is beginning to surface. Behind a door near the back of the property is a smaller room that does not appear clearly in the main photographs. Your soulmate had entered it only after the purchase process began, expecting nothing more than storage. Instead, they found a wide window facing the landmark across the road and an old built-in shelf that had survived every renovation. On that shelf sat something left behind by the previous owner. A framed photograph of the neighborhood taken many years ago. Your soulmate reportedly froze when they saw what appeared near the edge of that image. It wasn't your face. It wasn't theirs. But it was something connected to the story you once told them, something that finally explained why this address had felt strangely familiar from the beginning. And when they turned that old photograph over, there was a location written on the back. An address that was almost identical to the one now connected to your name, except for one startling difference. The difference was only one number, but it completely changed what your soulmate thought they understood. The address written behind the old photograph belonged to the neighboring property, the very place connected to the memory you had once described. Suddenly, the mystery became clear. Your soulmate had not somehow guessed your past, and the property had not appeared through some impossible coincidence. They had remembered the fragments you shared, recognized the landmark, and quietly followed those clues until they discovered that their secret property stood almost beside a location already meaningful to you. That realization explains why they refused to tell you the address immediately. They wanted you to see the photograph first, recognize the surroundings on your own, and experience the exact moment when an unfamiliar house suddenly became connected to something deeply familiar. But there was still one thing your soulmate had never explained: why transfer something this important to you now? The answer was hidden in the final page of their instructions. Your soulmate had written that keeping the property secret forever would eventually turn a loving surprise into a burden. They no longer wanted you standing outside the future they had been imagining. So they made a deliberate choice. Instead of waiting for some flawless moment, they wanted you to know that this home had been chosen with your voice, your memories, and your freedom in mind. The rooms were intentionally unfinished because they wanted your decisions to shape them. The box marked "for you" was there because they wanted the first key you held to feel like yours, not borrowed. Even the photograph was taken from the angle they believed would help you recognize the area before reading the address. And then came the most emotional detail of all. At the bottom of the instructions, your soulmate had written that if you ever entered the property, you should open the small drawer beneath the old built-in shelf before doing anything else. Inside that drawer was one final photograph. Unlike the others, it was recent. It showed the property at sunset, with the front door open and the unfinished room glowing softly through the window. On the back, your soulmate had written the complete address, followed by a short message explaining that the house itself was never supposed to be the biggest surprise. The real surprise was that they had listened closely enough to remember the small things you thought nobody noticed. They had carried those details with them, and when an opportunity appeared near a place tied to your past, they chose not to ignore it. Yet underneath that message was another line, one nobody had mentioned before. It referred to a second key hidden somewhere on the property and said it opened something that had deliberately been kept out of every photograph you've seen. And whatever stands behind that lock may reveal the one secret your soulmate still hasn't told you. The second key was never meant for another door inside the house. That is what makes this discovery so unexpected. Tucked beneath the final photograph was a tiny handwritten clue directing you toward the far edge of the property, beyond the unfinished room and past a narrow path almost invisible in the earlier pictures. Your soulmate had deliberately kept that section outside the camera frame. At the end of the path stands a small detached structure, modest enough to be mistaken for an old garden shed. But the newer documents describe it differently. It had been carefully restored after the main property was purchased, and the lock on its door matches the second key. Your soulmate spent months preparing that space without telling anyone except the trusted person handling the paperwork. Don't skip, because what they placed inside finally explains why becoming connected to this property meant far more than receiving a house. Behind that locked door is a quiet room containing almost nothing expensive. Instead, the walls hold pieces of a story. A map of the surrounding area. Copies of the earliest property photographs. Notes from your soulmate's search. Even a simple timeline showing when they first heard you mention the place from your past and when they eventually discovered this address. Suddenly, every supposed coincidence has an explanation. Your soulmate had been listening. Remembering. Searching without promising something they weren't certain they could deliver. But one section of the wall had intentionally been left blank. Beneath it was another handwritten message saying that the empty space belonged to whatever came next. Your soulmate did not want to decide the entire future alone. They wanted the next photograph placed there to represent a choice made together. Yet beside that blank space was one sealed envelope marked with a date that had not arrived when the room was prepared. That date is important because it reveals your soulmate had planned a specific moment to finally show you everything. But circumstances changed before that moment could happen, which is why the property information reached you differently than intended. Inside the envelope is a final set of instructions explaining that ownership was only the first surprise. There is another document connected to the land itself, something your soulmate arranged separately from the house. The trusted person was told not to reveal it until you had seen the address, recognized the landmark, found both keys, and understood why the property was chosen. Now every condition has nearly been met. And attached to that final document is a photograph taken from behind the small detached room, facing an area none of the previous pictures showed. At the center of that photograph is a boundary marker with your soulmate's handwritten arrow pointing beyond it. Whatever lies on the other side appears to be connected to the property too, and the note beneath the photograph contains only 4 words, "This is yours too." Those 4 words change the scale of the secret completely. Beyond the boundary marker is not another house, but a quiet stretch of land hidden behind mature trees, almost impossible to notice from the road. The additional document reveals that your soulmate arranged for this section to remain connected to the main property rather than letting it be separated and sold. At first, that decision seems unusual. Then you see the photograph taken from the far end of the land. From there, the house, the detached room, and the familiar landmark can all be seen in one frame. Your soulmate had discovered this view during one of their private visits and immediately understood why the extra land mattered. They weren't protecting it because of its financial value. They were protecting the one part of the property where the entire story could finally be seen at once. But look carefully at that photograph, because something appears beneath one of the oldest trees. It is a simple wooden bench, recently placed there, facing directly toward the house. Beneath it is a small metal container protected from the weather, and inside are several folded notes written at different times. They reveal how your soulmate's feelings changed during the months they kept this property hidden. The earliest note is cautious. They wondered whether showing you the house would be too much, too soon. Another was written after they returned to the property and remembered something you had said about wanting a place that felt peaceful rather than impressive. By the final note, their uncertainty had shifted into a decision. They would stop trying to create every detail themselves and leave the future open for you to shape. That is why rooms remained unfinished. That is why part of the wall was blank. And that is why the extra land was preserved. But the final note contains a reference to one more photograph, one that isn't inside the box. The trusted person knew exactly where that missing photograph had been kept. It was sealed separately with the most important property record, because your soulmate believed you should only see it after understanding everything else. The picture was taken from the road on the day the final arrangements were made. Your soulmate is not visible in it. The house stands quietly in the distance, the trees frame the entrance, and the address marker can finally be seen clearly. But beneath the photograph is a handwritten sentence explaining why that particular number meant so much to them. It connects the address not only to your past, but to the exact moment they decided they wanted a future with you. And beside that sentence is another date, much more recent than the first. That date marks the day your soulmate made one final change to the property documents, a change involving your name that nobody had expected. What they changed is about to reveal why the property didn't simply become available to you, it became yours. That final change was the decision your soulmate had hesitated over longer than anything else. Until that point, every arrangement surrounding the property had been designed to protect the surprise while still leaving them in control. But on the recent date written beneath the photograph, they changed course. Your name was no longer treated as someone who might simply be welcomed into the property someday. The instructions were revised so that you would have a real place in its future. That distinction mattered deeply to your soulmate. They did not want you entering the house feeling like a guest in someone else's dream. They wanted you to understand that the unfinished room, the land beyond the trees, the second key, and even that blank wall were intentionally waiting for you. Yet the document contained one unusual condition. Before the final papers were presented, you were supposed to be shown the clearest photograph of the address marker. When that photograph is placed beside the older image, something extraordinary becomes obvious. The address marker itself had been replaced. The original was faded and difficult to read, but your soulmate ordered a new one while keeping the same number. Why preserve it? Because that number was the detail that first stopped them in their tracks. It matched the date of the conversation when you unknowingly described the kind of home that would make you feel safe, settled, and free to be yourself. Your soulmate remembered that conversation long after you probably forgot it. So when they found a property near the familiar landmark and then saw that same meaningful number in the address, they couldn't walk away. It felt like several pieces of your story had unexpectedly met in one location. But stay with this, because the photograph reveals one more addition beside the new marker, a smaller plaque that wasn't there when the property was first discovered. The plaque contains no family name. Instead, it carries a short phrase your soulmate chose privately: "Begin here." Those words explain the entire secret. The property was never supposed to prove how much they could give you. It was supposed to become a place where neither person's past had to control what happened next. And yet, beneath the paperwork authorizing that plaque was another receipt, one nobody expected to matter. It was for a professional photograph taken inside the property on the same day the documents were changed. That image has remained sealed until now. Unlike every photograph you've seen, this one does not focus on the house, the landmark, or the address. It shows the unfinished room after your soulmate placed one final item in the center. The trusted person was specifically told not to describe that item to you. You were meant to see it for yourself, because attached to it is a message containing the one question your soulmate has been preparing to ask you ever since they decided this property should become yours. The sealed photograph finally shows what your soulmate placed in the center of that unfinished room. It is not an expensive gift. It is a simple table with two chairs facing the wide window, positioned so the familiar landmark can be seen in the distance. On the table rests the first key, the original photograph of the property, and a handwritten card. Your soulmate understood that after all the secrecy, you might have questions they could never answer through documents alone. So instead of filling the room with furniture and deciding what your future should look like, they created a place for one conversation. The card carries the question they had been preparing to ask: what would you choose if this truly belonged to you? Those words reveal why so much was deliberately left unfinished. But underneath the card is another photograph, and this one was taken before your soulmate ever owned the property. That older image shows the same room when it was almost completely empty, yet something unusual appears near the window, a faint marking on the wooden frame. Your soulmate noticed it during their first viewing and photographed it because the shape looked intentional. Later, while comparing the image with the old neighborhood records, they discovered that the marking had been there for years. It pointed toward the landmark across the road, almost like someone had once used that exact window to identify it from a distance. This was the detail your soulmate never told the trusted person at first, because it made the property feel even more connected to the memory you had shared. Still, they refused to build the entire decision around coincidence. They checked the history, revisited the location, and made sure the home was genuinely right before moving forward. Then, during that research, they found one final record attached to the neighboring address. And your family name was nowhere on it, but another familiar detail was. That detail was a name you had once mentioned while telling the story of your connection to this area. Suddenly, your soulmate understood that the memory you shared had deeper roots than they realized. They did not know the full relationship between that person and the location, so they deliberately left the question unanswered rather than making assumptions. But they saved a copy of the record for you. Now it sits beneath the photograph on that small table, sealed inside an envelope marked, "Only you can explain this." And there is something else inside, a hand-drawn map showing the main property, the neighboring address, and a narrow path between them that no longer appears on modern maps. At the end of that old path, your soulmate circled one tiny structure and wrote a single question beside it. Because if you recognize what once stood there, you may finally understand why this shocking address feels less like a random property, and more like a place your own story somehow left unfinished. The tiny structure at the end of that forgotten path was once a small gatehouse, and the moment its old photograph appears beside the map, another piece falls into place. It had disappeared from modern records after the surrounding land was divided years ago, but your soulmate discovered one surviving image in the property's archive. Look closely and there is a narrow sign hanging beside its entrance. The words are faded, yet one of them matches the name you once mentioned when describing your memory of this area. That is why your soulmate circled the structure instead of making assumptions about it. They knew there was a connection, but they wanted you to be the person who completed the story. More importantly, the old path from that gatehouse once continued directly toward the land that is now attached to your property. Suddenly, the address, the landmark, and the memory from your past are no longer three separate clues. They are part of the same location. Your soulmate apparently learned this only after the main arrangements were already underway. For a moment, the discovery actually made them consider stopping everything. They worried that choosing a place carrying so much history might feel overwhelming to you rather than meaningful. So they returned alone and stood near the old boundary marker, asking themselves whether they were preserving your memories or accidentally deciding what those memories should mean. Their answer changed the entire plan. They would give you control. Nothing important would be rebuilt without your choice. The forgotten path would remain untouched. The blank wall would stay blank. Even the gatehouse location would be preserved exactly as it was until you decided whether it belonged in your future at all. But before leaving that day, your soulmate took one more photograph from the end of the path. And in the distance, something appeared that they had never noticed from the house. It was another entrance to the land, almost completely hidden by years of growth. Beside it stood an older address stone, weathered and partially buried. Your soulmate cleared away just enough soil to read the number, and that was when the biggest question surrounding this property changed again. The number was not the current address. It belonged to the older layout of the land, from before the properties were divided. Your soulmate photographed it immediately and placed the image with the final records because they knew you needed to see it. On the back, they wrote that this might explain why the modern address felt strangely familiar even though you had never knowingly visited the current house. But there is one more detail on that buried stone. Beneath the old number are several carved letters. And when your soulmate compared those letters with the name from the neighboring record, they discovered a match that could reveal exactly how your past became connected to the property now waiting for you. The carved letters on that buried stone were the missing link your soulmate had been searching for. They matched the surname recorded beside the neighboring property decades earlier, the same name you had once mentioned while describing your memory of this area. Suddenly, the old gatehouse, the forgotten path, and the original address were connected by more than geography. Long before the land was divided, they had apparently belonged to one larger property. Your soulmate stared at the old photograph and finally understood why the modern address had seemed familiar without being exactly the place you remembered. The numbers had changed when the land was separated. The road had changed. Even the entrance had moved. But the view toward the landmark remained almost untouched. And there was one more discovery in the historical record, a handwritten notation beside the old address referring to a room that still exists inside the current house. That room was the unfinished room with the wide window. Your soulmate had believed it was simply an unusual space preserved through renovations, but the older documents gave it another purpose. Years ago, it had apparently served as the room from which the original owners could see both the gatehouse and the road beyond the property. That explained the faint marking on the window frame. It wasn't random damage. It had been placed there as a visual reference toward the old entrance. Your soulmate immediately returned to compare the angle, and when they stood beside that marking, they could see exactly where the forgotten path once began. Don't skip, because this is where the photograph becomes even more important. Your soulmate took a new picture from that precise position, and in the corner of the frame appears something that had been hidden behind an old section of wooden trim. Behind that trim was a narrow recess containing a folded piece of paper, aged enough that your soulmate refused to open it carelessly. It was later preserved and examined without damaging it. The paper held no treasure map and no dramatic promise, only a rough sketch of the original property boundaries, including the old gatehouse, the neighboring land, and the room where it had been hidden. But one handwritten mark stood out. Someone had drawn a small circle around the exact section of land your soulmate later preserved instead of selling separately. Beside that circle were two barely readable words, "Keep together." Your soulmate had made that same decision without ever knowing this note existed. And when they compared the sketch with the current property documents, they realized one final section of the original land might still be legally connected to the address. An overlooked strip beyond the trees that nobody had included in the photographs. What your soulmate found there is the reason one last image was sealed away from all the others. That last sealed image was taken beyond the trees, where the overlooked strip of land narrows toward an old stone boundary wall. Your soulmate had walked there expecting nothing more than overgrown ground. Instead, they discovered a second opening in the wall, almost completely covered by vines. Above it was a small stone panel carrying the same carved letters found on the buried address marker. That confirmed the forgotten strip had once belonged to the larger original property. But something else appeared in the photograph. Through the opening, barely visible beneath years of growth, was a short set of steps leading downward. Your soulmate did not rush forward. They checked the old boundary.